Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price is the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians. She joins me in the studio. Welcome back to 7:30, Senator.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sarah.
Will the Coalition continue to use closing the gap and its targets to drive its policy?
Well, I think the closing the gap measures are something that, are important at this stage. I would like to see more of a focus on who the most marginalised are, where those that are most affected exist, so that we take an even closer look beyond the current measures of closing the gap, is something that I'd certainly like to look at going forward.
Now, you've called for a new advancement movement. You've written about this in an essay to address disadvantage. Do you see yourself as the leader of that movement?
Well, it's something that I certainly would like to look at a different way of doing things. We've done things the same way over and over again.
What about you? Will you lead it?
Look, absolutely. I mean, I'm certainly putting it out there. I'm suggesting it. I would see myself as somebody who is setting forth on this consideration, absolutely.
Well, let me ask you about that, because you've said that you want to focus on Indigenous people living in remote communities. Now, it's well known how starved of resources those communities are. That's not a new fact, it's well known. Can you spell out what you would do specifically to reverse that?
Well, let's start with, so I've mentioned remote communities, absolutely, because the more regional and more remote you are, the more marginalised people become. And this is inclusive of non-Indigenous people as well. But of course, our most marginalised are those Indigenous Australians whose first language is not English, who are still connected very much so to traditional culture. So it would be taking an honest look at the things that affect those people, which is, we didn't see much of it in that article just before, but is the family violence situation. It's the fact that we've called for a Royal Commission of the sexual abuse of Indigenous children. These are where we need to have starting points to address the disadvantage of those in those communities.
Let me ask you, though, just some of the measures that you would take, because there has been a great deal of work done in examining the problem. We know how widespread some of these problems are. We have a lot of data now that's been collected about the level of disadvantage. What would you do to change the lives of people in those communities?
And I'll just say that's fair enough to say that, absolutely, but there also isn't a focus. There was no mention of the causes as to why people are incarcerated in that article.
Just come back to your plans, because I think, you've put yourself forward as a leader. I think people want to hear what specifically you do to change the lives of people in those communities.
Absolutely. We need to be honest. We need for a culture within Aboriginal communities to understand and condemn violence and levels of acceptance of violence in those communities. We need to protect children a lot better than what we do.
How would you do that?
Well, I wouldn't leave an Indigenous child in dysfunction because it is suggested that their culture and connection to country is more important than actually upholding their human rights. We need to find ways where we can take these children out of dysfunction so they're not left to fester in these circumstances. And as it stands, we're not doing that.
So how would you do that? If we talk about that particular element of dysfunction in community, what would you do to change that?
Early intervention in these children's lives, because we're not seeing that. We're seeing children being left in dysfunction. We're seeing that all over the place.
So that means more money. What kind of resources would you like to see put into those communities?
Well, I think it's not just about resourcing. Absolutely, I've talked about the fact that we need to look at where we can spend money better, but we need to first understand where money's being wasted in order to redirect funds into places that I would suggest are a priority, which is absolutely in upholding the human rights of Indigenous children.
And what about in other areas in those communities? So all of them, it's the whole suite that we see present. Education, employment. We've looked at incarceration. I'll come to that in a minute. But how are you changing the lives of people living in those communities, not just young people, but adults as well?
Absolutely. We need to get adults away from welfare. And I think I've spoken about this before. I know certainly in the Northern Territory, under the Land Rights Act, as traditional owners, we are seeing traditional owners now saying we want more opportunity within our communities under the way that they're governed through the Land Rights Act and through the land councils themselves. there is a hindrance to economic development in remote communities. But if we were to treat these communities like small country towns and allow for traditional owners to initiate economic development opportunities, they would become job creators. I guess much like the Gumatj in Yolngu country. They have their own mining company. They are able to provide jobs for their own people and their own country. And I know that traditional owners want those opportunities.
Let's just talk about Indigenous people outside of those communities, because you've said in your essay and in your speeches that you're very focused on that particular group of people. But we know that for Indigenous people outside of remote communities, they are also captured by those statistics and by those failure to meet the targets that we're seeing in closing the gap. Is it your intention that government programs would no longer be targeted at Indigenous people outside of remote communities?
So from the conversations that I've had, there are parts of certainly regional Australia, visited Toomala earlier this year, where those in that community suggested that the Aboriginal people from those communities want to work hand in hand with people from the broader community to bring about solutions. So they want to act like a whole community, not just be sort of treated as differently to the rest of the community.
Explain your thinking, because as I said, you're focused. You said we should focus on remote communities, the 20% of the 3% of Aboriginal people who don't speak English as their first language. What about people in urban settings? Does that mean that under a coalition government that the Indigenous policies would no longer provide the same level of services for Indigenous people in the cities?
So what I would suggest is that we serve, this is an argument that I've always put forward, that we serve Australians on the basis of need. And you're not automatically marginalised if you are Indigenous. In fact, we see very successful people of Indigenous heritage in our country living very successful lives. And within the more urban areas, within the cities, there is far greater availability to services and programs that it's available to everybody.
Let me just give you an example about that, because in some case the conditions for Indigenous people in urban settings are worse than in remote communities. Child safety is an example of that. The numbers of children needing to live in out-of-home care, 43% in out-of-home care are Indigenous, while they represent only 6% of the population. Are you saying that in urban settings there's no need for specific policies to target that level of need?
No, what I'm saying is that even in urban settings, Indigenous children are ultimately left in dysfunction, and Indigenous children are treated differently because of racial heritage. I don't think we treat any other children of different heritage that way. We don't say, okay, this child is of Indian heritage, therefore they need to be put in an Indian family. This child is of Chinese heritage, they need to be given to a Chinese family.
What about
when it comes to
education
care.
or health services, other areas where there is specific money put aside in government policy for Indigenous people living in urban settings? Would you put a stop to that?
I wouldn't say I'd put a stop to it, but what I'm saying is that I don't necessarily think we need a specific Indigenous focus when there is availability, when we should be treating everybody equally.
Even when the need is demonstrably greater from the data?
What you're suggesting is that the indigeneity element of these people is what is making them marginalised.
No,
I'm suggesting.
I think I'm saying what the data from Closing the Gap shows us, that Indigenous people in urban settings, in many cases, are doing very badly, are suffering from entrenched disadvantage. So the question is whether or not you continue to target them.
And again, the fact that Indigenous children, even in urban settings, are treated differently to others is what I believe is actually causing, when a child is left in dysfunction, they're fast-tracked to incarceration, whether it's youth incarceration or other issues, whether it's education.
Let me ask you about incarceration, just following on from that story. So we know that figure, which is really a national shame by any account, that the number of Indigenous people in prison has risen so drastically from 6,000 to about 15,000. How would your movement, this new movement you're describing, change that?
Well, I would suggest that we focus on the reasons why people are being incarcerated, because that is always a highlight, but we don't always talk about the fact that Indigenous children experience the highest rates of sexual abuse and neglect in our country. That is where we need to maintain our focus, because incarceration is further down the river. Prevention is better than cure, and that's where we need to maintain our focus.
So I can hear you saying asking questions, but there's other elements to that, isn't there? There's also education, there's health. The question comes back to, will a coalition government with you as potentially as the Indigenous Affairs leader target those issues, education, health, the whole suite of issues for Indigenous people in urban settings, or are we going to see a drastic change?
Well, I would suggest that we maintain a standard that is the same for every Australian, including Indigenous Australians. I think there is sometimes a culture in departments that suggests that Indigenous children are somehow different, that Indigenous people are different. We're not different. We're Australians, citizens just like everybody else, and therefore we should be maintaining a standard, which is what we're ultimately trying to achieve. But if you look at some of the culture within, education, it's always suggested no, somehow we learn differently. It's not the case at all. If we're all treated the same and expected to reach the same standards. In fact, the children from the AIF Foundation say that having high expectations is what has pushed them through. But we need to put support around these children so they're not left in dysfunction, so that they can get an education. Because ultimately, it doesn't matter what your background is. If you miss out on an education as a youngster, if you are exposed to domestic and family violence, then you are far more likely to end up in incarceration or have terrible outcomes in life.
Plenty more discussion on policy to come, but Jacinta Nampijinpa Price, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks for having me.